And here we go. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the palatial headquarters of Advanced Education Measurement, aka my spare bedroom. Sorry I can't be with you on Thursday, but it is very good to be able to cover some stuff here. What I'm going to do is, after a quick review, I'm going to cover the remainder of the stuff on sampling that I need to get to. And then I'll let you go and hope that you have a happy, safe spring break. All right. Quick review. We started off last time by discussing when we needed to do large N research. That was when a couple of times when that happens. One is when you need to know something about a large number of cases. Two, when you already have solid hypotheses. And three, when you need to establish strong causality. Generally, a Mannheim-Enriched style research project, as we've discussed in numerous fashion, is the best for establishing strong causality. Not perfect causality, but the ability to make causal claims is much higher than Phenno, I guess, if we're comparing it to something. The disadvantages are that one, it's not sometimes. Sorry, guys, blanking here. Sometimes there is a vibe or a depth that you can't get from quantitative measurement that you need to explore with Phenno. When you don't have a clear idea about what your hypothesis is going to be, sometimes data won't be available for Mannheim-Enriched style research. And there's the danger of missing the forest through the trees, as in, I can get so focused on my little manageable, discrete question that I can lose the relationship of my question to the big picture. In other words, I can start caring about student-teacher ratio for its own sake rather than understanding that it's merely one measure of academic quality, and academic quality is really what we care about. Okay, talked a lot the other day about the necessity about needing to recognize when Mannheim-Enriched style research is appropriate versus when Phenno style research is appropriate. The thing that you need to remember, well, two things you need to remember. One is that they both have their places and their times that they're good for. Two is that where one approach is strong, the other is weak, and vice versa. So Mannheim-Enriched is really good at establishing causal claims, something that Phenno's not that great at. But Phenno's much greater when you need to study like a process, or you need to get at something that you think is intangible, that can't really be measured. And I know they said there were two things, but let's do three things. Number three is that these things work best together, right? Since they complement each other so well, the approach that researchers often take is to do something that we refer to as a mixed methods approach, which basically means you're applying multiple different research styles, Phenno and Mannheim-Enriched type methodologies, and that allows you to cover your topic in the most direct possible way. Then we moved on to sampling, okay? The key points that we got to in Tuesday's lecture on sampling. One is a definition of what sampling is that most of the times we can't survey, test, evaluate the whole population of things that we care about. So we need some smaller group to stand for that larger population. That's what a sample is. A sample is a subset of a group that is designed to stand for the whole group. Now, hopefully if we've done everything right, we construct a representative sample. A representative sample is when your sample resembles the whole population closely enough that you can use your research results to make judgments about the whole population. In other words, we talked a lot about public opinion polls the other day. Public opinion pollsters do a lot of work to ensure that their sample is representative of the American public, because at the end of the day, they want to use their results to say something about the American public as a whole. So yeah, that's what a representative sample is, when your sample can actually stand and represent a whole population. How do you get a representative sample? Well, that's the $10 million question, and that's what we as researchers worry about a lot. Two-step process to getting a representative sample. All right. Part number one is generally we need to use random sampling techniques on a large enough sample size. All right. So random sampling is just the idea that any member of a population has an equal chance of being selected for a sample. So here is a thing full of pens. All right. I'm going to close my eyes and put my hand around and pull out a pen. I pulled out a pen at random, all right? That is basically exactly the logic we use to construct our sample. We like random sampling because, one, it takes all potential for selection bias out of the equation. And two, random sampling is the best way to ensure that your sample represents the whole due to the laws of probability. Over time, if you have 50 checkers or if you have 50 red checkers and 50 black checkers, if you keep pulling them out over time, eventually you're going to approach something like a 50-50 ratio. Now the catch is that random sampling only works to make representativeness over a large enough population. Because we can all imagine flipping a coin 10 times and getting 7 heads and 3 tails. That's not that unusual. It's only when you flip the coin like 100 times, 1,000 times, that you start to see something like a true 50-50 split come out, because the laws of probability only work with large samples. Larger samples give more time for the laws of probability to assert themselves. So it is important that your random sample be large enough to generate a representative population. How large is large enough? Large enough for the laws of probability to work, but maybe not as large as you think it needs to be. Remember that we talked about how presidential polling, the reputable pollsters like Gallup use a sample of 3,000 people to stand for 100 million potential voters. And they get really accurate results on the presidential election. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that. So, how do you get a representative sample? Number one is you do random sampling over a sufficient sample size. All right? The other thing that we can do, step number two, is that we can employ weighting. Weighting is when we have our sample, we see that our sample is unrepresentative in some ways that we think will make the results not representative of the whole population. And so therefore, we mathematically manipulate the sample so that it becomes more representative. Remember the example I used with how the presidential polling does it. The presidential polling disproportionately samples more white people that are in the general population. And so what people like Gallup, or what organizations like Gallup will do, is they will basically say, okay, white people in our sample, your vote is not going to count for one vote, okay? Your vote's going to count for like 0.85 of a vote. And in doing that, they're able to simulate conditions that make the sample more representative. In other words, so that you have the right number of whites, African Americans, Hispanic down the line. You may not achieve that with your random sampling, but you can use math to adjust it. We talked about how this can be a scary proposition, right? That messing with the random sample after the fact seems like a really good way to introduce the potential for bias. And maybe even to undo the logic and all the good we've done with our random sampling. Weighting should only be done when you have a reliable source to compare your sample to, or when you can validate your results after the fact. The first part of that. With presidential polling, we do have a more reliable source on what the American public looks like. how many women there are in the American public, how many people over 65, and all these different things that we think may impact the vote. We know we have a more reliable source in the form of the U.S. Census. So what presidential polls will do is that they will weight their sample so that their sample resembles the proportions of each of these groups that we see in the U.S. Census. The second part, which is validating against past results. Remember, public opinion pollsters, presidential pollsters, can check their results. They will make a prediction the day before Election Day, and then they get to see a result that allows them to know how good their prediction was. And if their prediction was wrong, they can go back and check it next time to adjust. You know, maybe they say like, oh, okay, we used these weights ended up being wrong. We'll try something different next time. There is a third way, third time in which we can employ weighting, and that is when we have a rigorous panel of experts who is available to sort of give us a sanity check on our weighting. I described the peer review process to you guys, and this is how academia handles matters like these. Is they have people who will look, you know, as part of the peer review process. If I want to get a journal article published, I need to, I need, you know, a reviewer may very well look at, oh, okay, he employed these weights on his samples, and they'll decide if those weights are justified or if I'm making faulty assumptions. All right. I think that's it for the review. Let me talk now about how sampling can go wrong. And the sort of prototypical example that every methods class in political science uses to talk about when sampling goes wrong is the 1936 Literary Digest survey about the presidential election. All right, Literary Digest was one of the country's biggest magazines in the 1920s. In 1928, they started doing a presidential poll. That presidential poll consisted of they would look into, they would send ballots to people in the mail, and then they would ask people to return those ballots with their choice of who they thought was going to be president. Then they published the results in like September or October before the election, and they said that through this sample that they took, they were going to be able to accurately predict the presidential election. They did a pretty good job in 1928. They did a pretty good job in 1932. Then came 1936. In 1936, using their sample, their methodology, they predicted that Alf Landon, the Republican nominee, would get 60% of the vote. I don't think you ever learned in grade school about President Alf Landon, and there's a good reason for that, is because President Alf Landon never existed. Instead, FDR won 60% of the vote. This was a huge scandal for Literary Digest, to the point that Literary Digest folded a couple years later, and the loss of credibility that they sustained from this presidential polling is largely cited as the reason why. So the question that we need to ask is, why did Literary Digest get it so wrong? And you won't be surprised to know that the reason they got it so wrong is because they did not have an accurate sample of the electorate. All right? Their sampling issues come primarily from two problems. All right? Problem number one is where they drew their sample from. So they mailed these ballots out to people. In order to get the mailing addresses, they looked at auto registries and the phone book. So basically they went through and they said, okay, everybody who buys a car, everybody who buys a car, we're going to send a ballot to, or some sample of them, right? Everybody who's in the phone book, we're going to send a ballot to. And this method did get a good response rate. It got 2.3 million people to respond. But the problem is that they were drawing from sources that did not represent the whole population. 1936, we're in the teeth of the Great Depression. people don't have enough to eat. People are starving to death. Something like 25% unemployment. You know, the worst economic time in United States history, probably. This meant that a lot of people couldn't afford phones. And it damn sure meant that a lot of people could not afford cars. And because they couldn't afford phones or cars, they were not in auto registries or phone books, which meant that Literary Digest had no way to know their addresses, if they even had fixed addresses, to send them ballots. This is a problem because the people that did own phones and automobiles were disproportionately affluent and disproportionately voted Republican. All right? So the population as a whole was significantly more Democrat than the ballots that Literary Digest sent out, the people that Literary Digest sent out to. That was problem number one. Problem number two comes from the idea that they asked people to mail back the ballots, okay? Asking people to mail ballots back is a version of what we in the business call straw polling, all right? Straw polling is the idea that we do a poll of the population based on volunteers who are willing to participate in the poll, right? So you will hear about this every presidential election cycle. The first thing that you'll hear about for the 2016 election, you'll hear about probably, I think it's Iowa's the first one, the Iowa straw poll. And that's when a bunch of different candidates have a meeting in Iowa. And basically at the end of that meeting, there's a vote of people that are willing to show up to a meeting and vote for their candidate. And this will happen, and the news will tell you that this is incredibly meaningful, and they'll say like, oh, is this person a real contender now? And the answer that you should have in your head is absolutely not, okay? In order to participate in a straw poll, you need to volunteer for the straw poll. In the case of presidential polling, you need to, in a February in Iowa, on a Saturday, you have to be the kind of person who is willing to go sit in a room for 8 hours, listen to people talk, give up one of the 2 days a week you might have for free time, just so you can cast a vote at the end. All right, that is a much higher standard of effort than is necessary for voting. Right, the normal voter is not going to do all that crap, especially for something that doesn't have any real impact, right? Who's going to do all that crap for a poll? Only crazy people, right? But shout out to you if you've ever been in a straw poll. You're my kind of crazy person. Voting is much easier, right? Voting in a presidential election is much easier. You just got to show up, stand in line for a little bit, and pull a lever. That's easy. It has real steps, and people are willing to do it. Now, let's get back to the Depression for a second and the Literary Digest poll. The Literary Digest poll was a straw poll in that it asked people to pay for a stamp of their own money, put it on the envelope, fill out the ballot, stick it in there, drop it in the mailbox. Okay? That you could have an interesting debate, right, about what's easier for a person to do, mail a letter or stand in line to vote. All right. But the point of which is that there were absolutely no consequences to the Literary Digest poll. Therefore, a lot of people didn't do it. And it turns out that disproportionately poor people, non-white people in any type of straw poll are less likely to vote than their counterparts in other demographic groups. All right. So because they did straw polling, the Literary Digest poll was unrepresentative as well. Okay? Moving to the present context, this issue of straw polling is something that places like Gallup struggle with today. All right? And they don't want to rely on people volunteering to give their information. Instead, they will try to call people at home, right? So you'll be sitting around at dinner one day in your life and somebody will call up and they'll be like, hey, I'm from the Gallup organization. Do you have a couple minutes to answer a few questions? All right. Modern pollsters have figured out that it is easier for people to let me start again. Modern pollsters have figured out that when you call people, it's far more representative. You get far more representative sample for a presidential poll than you will if you mail stuff out or anything like this. But this raises a whole host of questions. And Wyatt, here I finally get to answer your question, all right? One thing that presidential pollers have to decide about their sample these days is who to consider as a voter. Now, that may seem like a very basic, easy question, but when you start to unpack it, it's kind of complicated. We could construct our sample from registered voters, all right? So in other words, we call up, we ask people, we say, are you a registered voter? If they say yes, okay, great. Will you answer a few questions? If they say no, we'll say thank you very much and hang up, all right? The problem with that, though, is that we have good information that says all registered voters don't show up to vote. So then, if you're a pollster and you want to get the most accurate representation of results, you ask yourselves, okay, well, how do I simulate a condition in which all registered voters, where only some registered voters show up? So some polling organizations will call and go, hello, are you likely to vote? Now, likely to vote is a different question. Likely to vote allows somebody who is registered but doesn't plan to vote to say, nah, I think I'm going to sit this one out. And that's good, right? Then again, you call up a likely voter, you call somebody up and they say, oh yeah, sure, I'm going to vote, da-da-da. How many of them are going to forget to show up? All right. So there's a question in who you include in your sample for modern polling today. The use of cell phones. In the Nate Silver piece that you read for today, you hear Nate Silver talk about cell phone usage. Believe it or not, a lot of polling firms used to not include cell phones when they made their calls to construct their sample. That's a problem because I don't know about you. I don't have a landline anymore. And if you guys are anything like people your age, you don't have a landline either, right? It turns out that when you only rely on landlines, you oversample older people. I think older people is the main group, right? And you undersample younger people. So that was an issue that's beguiled polling in the past. Another issue with regards to voter turnout that was particularly relevant to the 2008 election. In 2008, how do you decide who's going to show up? Well, a lot of polls decided, you know what? In 2008, I'm just going to base my turnout, I'm going to base my sample on who showed up last time. All right. So if 60% white people showed up for the 2000 presidential election, and 60% white people showed up in the 2004 presidential election, I'll assume that 60% of white people will show up for 2008. All right. However, almost every pollster concluded that this was not the way to go in 2008. All right. And the reason is because we had a circumstance unlike any other in American history. For the first time, we had an African-American candidate who was running for president. So the question becomes, how do you construct a sample when you know that African-Americans and Hispanics and other non-white demographics, as it turns out, are more likely to show up? If that's never happened before, okay, well, how much turnout should we assume for them? Should we assume that their level of turnout is at 2004? No, probably a greater percentage of non-white people are going to show up to vote for the first non-white candidate in presidential history. Okay, do we double their turnout? Do we say that their turnout is going to be 150% more than it was last time? It was basically all educated guesswork. right? Because we had no precedent to validate our sample against. Incidentally, this has the potential to also be an issue in 2016, right? The front runner for the president, for the Democratic nomination for the Democratic presidential nomination is Hillary Clinton. If Hillary Clinton is the nominee, for the first time in American history, we're going to have a woman at the top of the ticket. So women may show up in greater numbers than they have in the past. Well, then how do you construct a sample for something that has no precedent? It's very difficult, all right? Good. All right, I think that's all I want to say about the Silver article. Let me end with a couple closing notes on sample, all right? This issue of small sample or large sample size, remember that I said that sometimes when we say increase your sample size, a sample size need not be as big as you think to be big enough. That being said, there are a couple criteria that we can consider when we're thinking about how big our sample size needs to be. All right. The number one is pretty basic, is how accurate do you need to be? All right. Every poll, as we've talked about, has a margin of error. So they'll say, okay, I think Hillary's going to get 50% of the vote with a plus minus of 3 points. What they're really telling you is that they think that Hillary Clinton's vote total is going to be between 47 and 53%. That's what that margin of error is. As you increase the sample, you lower the margin of error because basically you're taking guesswork out of the equation, because as the sample gets bigger, you're sampling more and more of the population. You're giving those laws of probability time to work out. So the more accurate you need to be, the larger your sample should be. Okay. Number two, and Sean, this is for you. How homogeneous is your population that you're sampling on? All right. In other words, if we want to know what all elderly people think, we're going to need a smaller sample than we will if we ask, what do all people think? And not just because there are fewer elderly, right? The elderly is one group. Therefore, we assume that there's going to be a limit to the amount of diversity in that group. As we increase potential sources for diversity, there are more aspects of diversity that we need to capture, and we need to increase our sample size. All right? I can go over this again right after break if this is problematic, but just like the more heterogeneous, the more diverse your sample is, the larger your sample needs to be. Third and final consideration for sample size, how many variables do we have? In other words, how many questions are we going to ask? If we're going to ask a lot of questions, it's the same as in step 2. If we're going to ask a lot of questions, we need to make sure we capture the diversity of responses on those questions, so we need a larger sample. All right. With that, I'm going to wrap this up. Have a great spring break. I will see you afterwards, and yeah, take care.